Thank you very much, Peter. And I would like to add my welcome to all of you here and to this beautiful room and an even more beautiful venue outside. Just earlier this month, I was at the annual meeting of the geographers of the United States, which interestingly is a fundamentally disciplinary community, quite unlike ours, which is a fundamentally interdisciplinary community. But of course, the geographer meetings was an order of magnitude larger, of about 9,000 people. So it's a special pleasure to welcome all of you here, and also those of you that are in the overflow rooms. It's a much more interdisciplinary community, fundamentally international as well, but on the other hand, it's a smaller, more intimate community. So over the next 3 days, I look forward to really invigorating and stimulating conversations and deep conversations to follow. So what I would like to look at and focus on a little bit is reflecting on how we got to where we are and just thinking about our trajectory to look ahead in terms of where the land system science community has been and where it's headed, particularly when it comes to the normative aspects of our research and of our science, as Pete was pointing out. So many of us are familiar with this picture, and many of us were actually fortunate enough to be on the ground level, or perhaps the first generation of land use, land cover change scientists. But our work, of course, dates all the way back to the initial framings of global change science that emerged in the 1980s, really. And by the mid-90s, we had the confluence of interests in land, as reflected not just by the physical science and biological science community's interest in land, but fundamentally and importantly, the social science community's interest in land as well, right? So we had the genesis of the Land Use Land Cover Change program, which continued to really do a lot of groundbreaking work and some very important synthesis products as well. And GLP, as it emerged in 2005, very much took on that mantle, right, of systems focus, interdisciplinary, spatial, social, and ecological science focus on land as a nexus, as Peter was pointing out in his earlier comments. And in the first decade, of course, GLP continued as a joint project of the IHDP and IGBP, but very importantly, with the emergence of Future Earth, which was announced at the Rio Plus 20 conference, we had a new set of partners and alliances and institutional framework within which we anchored ourselves. So, as I mentioned, really in 2015, we enter a new institutional space. We become a global research project of Future Earth and the Future Earth Enterprise. And so with it comes a whole set of new initiatives and impetus, particularly in terms of the transformation to sustainability. And very fundamentally towards that, there was an overt and strategic move to interface with the global community, really focusing on normative societal goals. And one of the major ways in which GLP has engaged with that, also at a global platform, is to engage with the United Nations programs. So I'd like to point out a couple. Of course, there are several in which the land system science community is involved, but a couple that are worthwhile to highlight are the IPBES plenary coming up in literally a week's time, and the launch of the first ever global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services to happen in Paris next week, at which many of our members of the community are going to be present. And another one that I would also like to highlight is one in which Peter has been fundamentally involved, of course, and that is the Global Sustainable Development Report, due for unveiling in July, correct? And so these are just two of the many initiatives within which our land science community has been fundamentally and centrally involved. So how do we do this? How are we organized today? Just a few words about some of the main modularities, or some of the main vehicles, as we like to say, in terms of how we get the work done. So of course we are a broad community, a very diverse community of scientists. In terms of the scientific steering committee, our goal there really is to support and do some of the agenda setting, but just really support and amplify some of the amazing scientific and translational work that our community is involved in. The IPO, the International Project Office, has a key role to play in that, in supporting the community, but also very importantly in actually interfacing with the normative kind of partners. So really working fundamentally on the science policy interface and getting our message out from the land science community to the kind of normative policy community as well. The nodal offices, of which we have 8, are really important vehicles as well to support land system science and translational work in regional centers of excellence and promote and support that work throughout. And finally, especially it's begun about 1.5 years or so ago, we're operating through a certain number of working groups and contributing projects to really kind of get the message out and get the science done. The open science meetings are, of course, fundamental in terms of bringing the community together and focusing on some of the past accomplishments, but really importantly, looking forward to where we're headed. And the last meeting was in Beijing, as Peter mentioned, and I think we have made some really interesting progress even since in those couple of years. So it'll be wonderful to actually focus on that in the next 3 days. All of you, I think, are familiar with this diagram, which is prominently highlighted on our website, of course, but I won't go into the details of the individual goals or objectives of our science plan. I will let Patrick speak to that in just a few minutes. But essentially, at the heart of our sort of substantive interests across these different dimensions is a very diverse and broad set of methodological and perhaps even philosophical and paradigmatic approaches. And this is just a slide taken from the Find Our Scientist kind of database that we have in the GLP, kind of reflecting what the methodological expertise or interests and diversity is across our community members. And as you can see, there's a pretty broad diversity, but there's also some concentrations of our methodological choices, particularly in terms of increasingly decision support tools and so on, which is not surprising given some of the translational moves we've been making towards the normative sphere as well. But of course, some of the fundamental mainstays of land science remain in terms of the spatial analysis and modeling, participatory methods, both quantitative and qualitative social science methods as well. We are a very diverse bunch here present at this open science meeting. As Pete mentioned, over 600 scientists from 66 countries represented. And this is just a snapshot from the top 100 sort of themes or words taken out of the abstracts submitted to this conference. And what this, I think, points out very eloquently is the fact that land is the ultimate boundary object. Right? It is the fundamental intersectional ontological entity with which we're interested. And it really kind of highlights all of these different topical interests that we have as land scientists, including biodiversity, food systems, forests, urban spheres, and so on. And importantly, an opportunity to highlight those trade-offs, those very real trade-offs, and then synergies in those different sorts of systems. What's also interesting is not very prominent, but also quite present in the top 100 abstracts, is the word however, right? And I think it highlights the contingent nature of our findings, right? Everything is in the observer's eye, right? So that jumped out at me. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that we produce very place-specific and context-specific science. And that is important to actually highlight. And we are not alone in doing that. But we also actually bring to the normative sphere a fundamental set of knowledges about land as a system, right? And land change as really a system dimension. So something to highlight in the next few days is also, given that contingency, given that systems approach, what are the new directions in which we're moving when it comes to methodological diversity and in terms of our partnerships?